For 22 years, my husband told me I could not be trusted to balance a checkbook, and the whole town agreed that I was a lucky woman to have a man who handled everything. Keith was a deacon and a baseball coach, and the kind of man people in our part of Tennessee call the salt of the earth, and he had spent half my life teaching me, gently and constantly, that I would be lost without him. I'm going to tell you about the night I sat down at the organ in our empty church and finally let him hear what I had actually sounded like all along, after 22 years of playing underneath him where nobody ever looks. But first, I have to tell you how a man can erase a woman in plain sight, with a whole congregation smiling at the both of them. My name is Della. I am 50 years old, and I have played the organ at First Methodist in our little town since I was 19, which means I have spent more of my life on that bench than off it. I teach piano and chorus to the children at the elementary school, and on Sundays, I am the sound underneath the singing. That is what an accompanist does, you understand? You are not the voice everyone came to hear. You are the thing that holds the voice up, the chords underneath, the harmony nobody notices until it is gone. I am very good at being the thing underneath. I have a trained ear, and I can hear a single voice go flat in a choir of 40, can hear the one note that is wrong while everyone else just hears music. It is strange, looking back, that I could hear a flat note in a hymn from across the sanctuary and could not hear, for 22 years, the thing that was off-key in my own marriage. If you have ever been quietly made small by someone the rest of the world calls wonderful, if you have ever been told you were lucky while you were drowning, then I think you already know the particular silence I am about to describe. Tell me in the comments what town you are listening from, and whether there is someone in your life that everyone praises and only you can hear is flat. I read every one. There is an odd kind of relief in a room full of people who all heard the wrong note alone. Let me tell you who I was before, because that is the part that makes the rest a tragedy instead of just a sad story. I was not a timid girl. At 19, I was the youngest church organist in 3 counties, and I had a scholarship offer to study music in Nashville, a real one, and I can still feel the shape of the life that almost was. And then I met Keith, who was handsome and certain and 4 years older. And Keith had a way of looking at a thing he wanted that made you feel chosen. He told me Nashville was a hard road for a girl, that a music degree was a fine hobby, but no way to build a life. That what I really wanted, if I was honest with myself, was a home and a family right here. He did not forbid me from going. He was far too smart for that. He just talked, warmly and reasonably, week after week, until going started to feel like a selfish, foolish idea that I had thought up myself. I stayed. I married him. I have spent 30 years since wondering about the girl who got on that road instead, and I only recently understood that the wondering was the point. A man like Keith does not take your future from you in one grab. He talks you into handing it over and thanking him for the advice. I can still see the afternoon I told him about Nashville. I had the letter in my hand, the scholarship letter, and I was lit up in a way I have not been before or since. And Keith took the letter and read it and told me how proud he was. And then he started asking questions. Just questions. Did I know what the rent ran up there? Did I know how many girls with a little church talent stepped off the bus in Nashville every year and came home broke? Had I really thought about who would look after my mother, who was poorly then? He never once said no. He was far too smart to say no. He just asked, warm and worried, until by the end of the afternoon, I was the one folding the letter back up. I was the one calling it a foolish dream. I was the one comforting him for having worried. That was the whole of his method, and I did not see it for 30 years. He never took a single thing out of my hands. He made my own hands set it down, and then he held me while I grieved it. And I called that being loved. Here's the thing about how Keith ran our marriage, and I need to make it plain, because it does not look like cruelty from the outside, and that is exactly why it works. Keith was not a man who hit. Keith was not a man who screamed. Keith was a man who handled things. He handled the money, all of it, from the very start. And I was given an allowance for groceries and made to bring back the receipts. And if I had spent $2 he did not understand, we would go over it together, patiently, him explaining and me apologizing, until I felt like a child who had been caught. He handled the decisions. He handled, over the years, my friendships, the ones he found reasons to disapprove of until it was easier to let them go than to argue. And the whole time, to the entire town, he was the most generous man alive. Because the cruelty was never in what he did in public. In public, he opened doors and paid for other people's coffee, and stood up in church and gave thanks for his family. The cruelty was in the private arithmetic, the slow daily teaching that I was scattered, that I was lucky, that I could not manage, that without Keith handling everything, Della would simply fall apart. I will give you one Tuesday out of 1,000, so you can feel the shape of it. I had bought a winter coat. My old one had worn through at the elbows 2 seasons running, and I found a plain one on sale for $30-some, and I brought home the receipt the way I always did, and Keith sat me down at the kitchen table, not angry, he was never angry, and went through it with me. Did I truly need a new coat, or did I just want one? Had I checked the thrift store first? He was not forbidding me the coat, he explained. He was only helping me think it through, because I had a way of letting little wants run away from me. And by the end of it, I was apologizing for a $30 coat to a man I would learn, years later, was quietly sitting on more money than I knew we had. And I took the coat back to the store the next day, because the shame of it had soured the whole thing. That is what an allowance really is in a marriage like mine. It was never about the money. The money was just the leash, the one they let you feel a little every single day, so you never once forget whose hand is holding the other end. There was a woman named Sherry who taught 3rd grade across the hall from my music room, and for a few good years, she was the best friend I had. Sherry was loud and divorced, and she laughed from down in her belly, and she thought I was funny, which no one had told me in years. And Keith did not care for Sherry. He never said it outright. He just had a small comment ready every time, that Sherry seemed bitter, that divorced women do like to pull the married ones down to their level, that he worried she was a poor influence, and that he only mentioned it because he loved me. And slowly, it became more trouble than it was worth. The little chill in the house after I had spent an afternoon with her. And so I let Sherry drift, the way I had let so many things drift. And I told myself it was nothing at all. I want you to remember Sherry, because she comes back into this. The people they quietly cut you off from are very often the exact people who will be standing right there, completely unsurprised. On the day you finally wake up, and the worst part, the part I am almost ashamed to tell you, is that after enough years, I believed it. That is what this kind of marriage does, the quiet kind, the kind nobody calls abuse because there is no bruise to point at. It does not break your bones. It rewrites your own opinion of yourself, slowly, in your husband's handwriting, until you genuinely cannot tell anymore which thoughts are yours and which ones he installed. By the time I was 45, I had a music degree's worth of talent I no longer trusted, an allowance I had to account for, and a deep, settled belief that I was a slightly foolish woman who had been carried her whole life by a patient, long-suffering man. I would have told you, and meant it, that I was blessed. I had simply forgotten that I had ever been the youngest organist in 3 counties. He had played that note out of me so slowly, I never heard it stop. The one thing he never could take, though I think now he tried, was the music itself. He could talk me out of Nashville and out of piano students and out of a $30 coat. But on Sunday mornings, I sat at that organ, and for a few minutes I was 19 again and certain. my hands knowing exactly what to do without asking a soul's permission. I believe he let me keep it because a deacon's wife at the organ looked well on him, and because it never once crossed his mind that the one room where I was still entirely myself might someday be the room I walked out of his marriage from. The thing they let you keep because it flatters them is sometimes the very thing that saves you in the end. He should have taken the music, too. It was the only part of me he never managed to convince I could not do. I want to tell you about the way the town held it all in place, because that is its own kind of prison. In a small southern town, a marriage like ours has a name, and the name is a good Christian marriage. Keith handled everything, because that is what a godly man does, the head of his household, and I deferred to him, because that is what a godly wife does. And the whole arrangement was not just tolerated, it was admired. Women my age would tell me how lucky I was that Keith took care of all the hard things. The pastor held us up as an example, so on the rare day I felt the wrongness of it rise up in me, there was nowhere to put it, because to question Keith was to question the entire order of things that my whole community was built on. I was not being mistreated, you see. I was being provided for. There is no language for suffering inside a thing everyone around you calls a blessing, and so I had no words. And a woman with no words for her own life is a woman who stops believing the life is even hers to describe. I think often of the church anniversary supper the year Keith was made head deacon. He stood up to say a few words, and he thanked the Lord, and he thanked the congregation, and then he turned to me, sitting there in my taken-back coat, and he told the whole fellowship hall that he could not have done any of it without his Della, who kept the home fires burning while he did the Lord's work. And the room went warm, and women reached over to squeeze my hand, and I smiled, because what else is there to do? And even then I understood, dimly, that I had just been thanked in public for disappearing, keeping the home fires burning. That was the whole of what I was permitted to be, the warmth in the background of his accomplishment. And the terrible genius of it was that it was said as praise, in a church, in front of everyone, so that any grief I felt about it could only be read as my own ingratitude. You cannot mourn a cage that the entire room keeps congratulating you on. There were our 2 children, too, and I will tell you that the hardest thing I have ever carried is watching them learn to see me the way their father did. Not cruelly. Keith was never cruel about me in front of them in a way you could name. It was lighter than that, and worse. It was the fond eye roll when I misremembered a date. It was Keith saying, with a chuckle, "You know how your mother is," until knowing how your mother is became a settled family fact, a little joke the 3 of them shared about scattered, sweet, unreliable Della. My son and daughter grew up inside a story where their father was the steady one, and their mother was the lovable mess he managed. And they loved me, I never doubted that. But they loved me the way you love someone you have been taught you cannot quite rely on. To lose your children's respect without ever losing their love is its own slow grief, and I drank it for years. There was a night, the winter I turned 49, when I came as close as I ever came to simply accepting that this was the whole of my life. I had asked Keith, carefully, the way I had learned to ask for things, whether I might take on a few more piano students, just for a little money of my own. And he had smiled and said, "Now, Della, you know you take on more than you can handle. Let's not set you up to fail." And he had said it so kindly, with such apparent love, that I had thanked him. I had thanked him for talking me out of wanting something. And that night, I sat in the dark at my own kitchen table and I thought, this is it. I am 49 years old, and I will be 79 years old, and it will be exactly this. And I am too far in and too worn down and too unsure of myself to ever be anything but Keith's scattered wife. I had stopped, by then, even hearing the flat note. I had just decided it was the song. What changed everything was not a confrontation, it was a folder. Keith went away that February to a coach's clinic in Knoxville. 3 days, and the church treasurer was out sick. And the pastor, in a small mercy that changed my whole life, asked me to pull some figures together for the budget meeting. Because everyone knew Della had a head for music, but nobody remembered she had also, once, had a head for numbers. I sat down to do a simple, honest task, and somewhere in the course of it, I needed our own tax paperwork for a comparison, and I went into Keith's study, into the file cabinet I had never once had reason to open, and I found a folder. And the folder rearranged my entire life in the time it takes to read a few pages. I am not going to make it more dramatic than it was, because it did not need to be. The folder held the truth Keith had spent 22 years making sure I never saw. It held our actual finances, which were not the careful, just barely getting by finances Keith described to me every month over the receipts. We were, it turned out, comfortable. More than comfortable. There was money I had never been told existed, in accounts with only his name, money that had come in part from the sale of my own late parents' little house years ago, money I had grieved as gone. And tucked in behind all of it, in his neat coach's printing, were the early, careful plans of a man getting ready to leave. A consultation with a lawyer 2 towns over, a separate account recently opened, notes in his hand, about timing, about waiting until our daughter finished school, about, and I read this part 3 times, what Della will and won't be entitled to. He had been keeping me dependent and small and grateful, on purpose, with a plan, so that when he was ready to set me down, I would be too convinced of my own helplessness to do anything but accept whatever he decided to hand me. I want to be honest about what I felt, sitting on the floor of that study, because it was not what you might think. It was not heartbreak, not at first. It was the strangest, clearest quiet I had felt in 22 years. Because every flat note I had been told I was imagining, every time I had been called scattered for sensing that something did not add up, every apology I had made for my own perfectly good instincts, all of it suddenly resolved into a single, true chord. I was not crazy. I was not scattered. I had been right the whole time about the thing being off key. And I had spent 22 years being trained to mistrust the one instrument I had ever been able to count on, which was my own ear. The man had not just been planning to leave me. He had been planning to leave me convinced it was a kindness. I sat there a long while, and I went back through 22 years with the new ear, the way you go back through a whole piece of music once you've finally heard the wrong note and can no longer unhear it. Every time I had sensed we had more than he let on and been told, kindly, that I did not understand money. Every instinct I had ever had about a friend, a decision, a feeling that he had so patiently corrected out of me. It had not been a marriage with a few rough patches. It had been a long, careful, loving-sounding project, and the project was me. And the entire goal of the project was a woman who would never trust herself enough to leave. He had very nearly finished it, too. Another year or two, and he would have set me down exactly as he had planned, and I would have gone quietly, grateful for the soft landing, and never once known that I had been pushed. The first person I called was Sherry. I had not had a real conversation with her in 6 years, and I called her from the front seat of my car outside that bank. And when she heard my voice, she did not say, "I told you so," though heaven knows she had earned the right. She just said, "Tell me where you are. I'm coming." And she came, and she sat with me, and she was the first human being in 22 years to hear the whole of it, and not tell me I was overreacting, not remind me how lucky I was, not reach for Keith's side out of plain habit. She only listened, and at the end of it, she took my hand and said, "Della, honey, you are the sanest woman I know. and you have been carrying this all by yourself the whole time. I cannot fully tell you what it did to me to be believed. If you have been alone inside something like this, go and find your Sherry. Find the one person they taught you to mistrust the most, because that is so often the one person who was never once fooled. Here's what I did, and I did not do it in a rage, because rage was never going to be the thing that freed me. I made copies of every page, quietly, the way you preserve a recording of a performance so that later no one can tell you it never happened. I put the folder back exactly as I had found it, and then, over the next 2 weeks, while Keith went on being handled and admired and certain, I did the small, unglamorous, terrifying things a woman does when she finally decides to stop being underneath. I went, by myself, to a lawyer, a woman, 2 towns over, the same distance Keith had gone, which I will admit gave me a grim kind of satisfaction. I opened an account in my own name at a bank where Keith knew no one. I called the school and told them yes, I would take the full music position they had been offering me for years, the one I had always told them I had to check with my husband about. I did not announce a single one of these things. I just, quietly, one note at a time, started playing my own line. I want you to understand how enormous these small things felt. Because if you have been where I was, I will not have to explain it. And if you have not, you may not be able to imagine it. Opening a bank account is nothing. A teenager can do it on a phone. But for a woman who has been taught for 22 years that she cannot be trusted with money, walking into a bank alone and signing my own name on my own account felt like stepping clean off the edge of a cliff. My hand shook so badly that the young teller asked if I was feeling all right. I was more than all right. I was doing the most frightening and the most ordinary thing I had ever done, which was to behave as though I were a competent grown woman, and to discover, with every trembling signature, that I actually was one, and always had been, and had simply been told otherwise so many thousands of times that I had filed it away as a fact about myself. And then I let Keith find out the way he had let me find out everything, which is to say, by accident, in his own time, with no warning. He came home one evening and the bank had flagged something, some small automatic thing, and he came to me holding a statement with a face I had never seen on him in 22 years, a face with actual fear in it. And he said, "What is this? Della, what have you done?" And I told him I knew about the folder. I watched the certainty drain out of him, and I understood, finally, that it had always been a performance, that the man who handled everything had been terrified the whole time that someone would notice he was mostly just very good at making other people doubt themselves. The reckoning, when it came in the one place that had always been mine. He followed me to the church that night, because I had told him I needed to think, and the church was where I went to think. And he found me up in the loft at the organ in the empty, dark sanctuary, the one room in our whole life he had never managed, because the music was the one thing he could admire but never do. And he stood at the bottom of the loft stairs and he tried, one more time, to do the thing that had always worked. He got reasonable, he got warm. He talked about our family, about how I was overwhelmed, about how we could fix this, about how I was not myself, about how I would regret throwing away a good life over a misunderstanding. 22 years that voice had been able to talk the want right out of me. I did not argue with him. I have never won an argument with Keith in my life, because winning was a game he had built the rules of. Instead, I turned back to the organ, and I played. I pulled the stops and I played the loudest, fullest, most certain thing I knew, a thing with both hands and both feet, the kind of playing I had not let myself do in decades because Keith found it showy. And I filled that empty church with a sound he could not talk over and could not handle and had never once been able to make himself. It went up into the dark rafters and came back down over the both of us. And for the first time in 22 years, the loudest thing in that room was not Keith. It was me. And when I finally lifted my hands and the last of it faded up into the beams, I turned around on the bench and I looked down at him standing there in the dark, small now, finally. And I said the only thing I had left to say. I said, "You spent 22 years telling everyone I couldn't manage. Keith, I have been the only thing managing for years. You just made sure the lights were always on you." And I gathered my music, and I came down the stairs, and I walked past him and out into the night. And for the first time in my adult life, there was no one underneath me and no one on top of me. There was just me, walking to my own car with my own keys in the quiet. Now here is the cold part, and it is colder than any scene could be, because Keith did exactly what men like Keith do, and it destroyed him without my lifting another finger. He could not stand to be the one left, so he got ahead of the story. He went to his family and to the church and to anyone who would listen, and he told them that poor Della had finally lost her grip, that the strain had gotten to me, that he was heartbroken, but he had seen it coming, that he only hoped I would get the support I needed. He reached, the way he always had, for the story where he was the steady one and I was the mess. And for the first time in 22 years, it did not take. Because here is what Keith never understood about the machine he had built. He had spent 2 decades teaching that whole town to measure people by a hard, bright standard. The upright man, the godly household, the one who handles his affairs and keeps his word and does right. He had stood at the front of that church and held everyone to it. And when the truth of the folder came out, as truth in a small town always does, when people learned that the deacon who lectured on stewardship had hidden his own wife's inheritance and lawyered up in secret while she counted grocery receipts, the very standard Keith had built to elevate himself swung around and measured him. And he came up short in front of every single person whose admiration had been the only thing he truly owned. The town did not turn on me, the scattered wife. The town turned on him, the man who had made his whole life out of a yardstick, the moment they finally held him to it. He sowed a marriage where one person had to be small so the other could look tall, and he reaped a whole community that, the second I stood up straight, could suddenly see exactly how small he had been all along. The folder was his, the plan was his, the standard was his. I did not have to do a thing but stop being underneath it. His own mother was the one who finished it, which I never saw coming. Faye had spent 22 years treating me like a girl her boy had been generous to marry, and I expected her, of all people, to close ranks around her son. But Faye had buried a husband who handled everything, a man cut from the very same cloth as Keith. And when the truth of that folder worked its way through town, something in her that had been quiet for 50 years apparently decided it had been quiet long enough. She did not make any speech. She simply stopped defending him in front of the whole family in that pointed way that says everything. And she started telephoning me on Sunday afternoons. And once, near the end of it, she said to me, low, "I should have warned you, honey. I knew what he was. I'd just gotten so used to it, I'd quit seeing it." 2 women, 2 generations, both told their whole lives that they were lucky. She had needed me to get myself free before she could finally say out loud that she never had been. My children, I will give you that, because it is the part I prayed over the most. It did not all come back at once, the respect I had let them learn to live without. But my daughter came to me a few weeks after, quiet, and she said, "Mom, I didn't know about the money, about any of it." And I said I knew she didn't, because the whole point had been that nobody knew. And she sat with me a while, and then she said, "Will you play me the loud thing?" Daddy always said you couldn't really play. And I laughed, for what felt like the first time in years, and I played my girl the loud thing, both hands and both feet, and I watched her face do the math, watched her revise a story about her mother that she had been handed before she was old enough to choose it. That was the sweetest note I ever played. My son took longer, and I have made my peace with that, because he had built more of who he was on his father's version of things, and it costs a man something to pull that version down to the studs and look at what it was holding up. But he came around in his own quiet way. He showed up one Saturday at my new little place across town and rehung a cabinet door that had been swinging crooked, the way his daddy used to do for me. Except when he was finished, he stood back and wiped his hands and said, "You probably could have done that yourself, Mom. I figure you can do just about anything." He said it almost like a question, the way you try on an idea you are not yet sure you are allowed to believe. And I told him yes, I probably could have, but that I was awful glad he came by. You do not get the years back, I have learned, but every now and again you get to stand there and watch one of your children quietly rewrite you, from a woman who could not to a woman who could. And that is its own kind of grace. Even arriving as late as it did, I had spent so long being a cautionary footnote in my own family. It was a strange and holy thing to feel myself become, sentence by sentence, the main melody again. I have spent my whole life as an accompanist, the sound underneath. So let me leave you with the truest thing the music ever taught me. There is a difference between harmony and disappearing, and it is the most important difference there is, and it took me 50 years to learn it. Holding someone else up is a beautiful thing to do with your life, right up until the day you realize you have been holding them up by lying down. If there is a voice in your life that everyone praises and only you can hear is flat, you are not imagining the wrong note. You have a trained ear. You have always had it. And the day you finally get up off the bench and play your own line, loud, with both hands, in the one room they could never take from you, you will find out the thing they spent your whole life making sure you would never learn. You were never the accompaniment. You were the reason there was any music at all.